Okay. Hi, everyone. Well, let's get started. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming today. Wonderful to see you. Wonderful to see such a great turnout. You may have noticed I am not HEPI Director and former Conservative Special Advisor Nick Hillman. Nick is currently, unfortunately, stuck on a train. He's coming back from Dublin today. Stuck in the snow. So Nick is, hopefully, will be able to join us some part way through. And thank you also for bearing with us on the name badges. Feels sort of like a children's party, doesn't it? But thank you very much, Gavin and Micah, for sorting those out. So we've got a very exciting event today. We're very excited to be here in Northern Ireland as well. So from HEPI, we're the Higher Education Policy Institute, in case you're not aware of us before. We are a UK-wide think tank, so we do research on the whole of the UK, on all kinds of policy areas related to higher education. And I think so while we have definitely attended and spoken at a number of events in Northern Ireland before, I think this is possibly the first that we've hosted, but regardless, it's lovely to be here. This is a series of 4 events that we're hosting in conjunction with London Economics. The first one was in London earlier this week, and we've got 2 in Edinburgh and in Cardiff next week, with the goal of, with the general election coming up in the UK, of building public awareness around fees and funding models. And London Economics have got some fantastic research that they're going to share with you in just a moment. So the format for today, we're going to have some presentations from Gavin, who's a partner at London Economics, and Micah, who's a director at London Economics. And they're going to present their findings to you. We'll then have a very short, sort of 10-minute window for them to take some questions. And we'll sort of do a first round of questions then. We'll then be listening to our fantastic panel. What they're going to do is they're going to give short responses. We're going to ask that you keep those really strictly to 5 minutes, please, so we can make tons of time for questions. And then we'll have a final round of questions from the audience before we wrap up. So on that note, Gavin, Micah, lovely to hear from you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, everybody, for coming along today. So in the spirit of offering thanks, I'd like to thank QEB for hosting this event today, and also HEPI for organising some pretty serious logistics. They got it almost all right, except for the snow, but we'll let them away with that. So this piece of research work, it's been funded by the Nuffield Foundation. Okay. So this is ahead of it's a general election briefing across the 4 nations of the UK. What we've done is we've undertaken some research to identify essentially the resource flows between students, graduates, between higher education institutions and the Exchequer in each of the 4 home nations on a like-for-like basis. We've produced 4 policy notes, essentially saying this is the lie of the land, as well as modelling some scenarios. Now, the point about the scenarios that we've modelled, they're not our choices or preferences or anything else. These are just illustrative. What happens if you introduce real interest rates? What happens if you cut fees? Who wins, who loses, et cetera, et cetera. We've had 1 public event so far. We have another 2, as Josh said, in Edinburgh and in Cardiff next week. So that's stage 2. And then after that, we're engaging with all major political parties across the UK. So we're going to get in contact with them and we're going to offer analytical support. So basically, it's a case of, we've got the model. If you want to see what does free fees look like, come and have a chat and we'll do the analysis for you. If you want to have a means-tested fee, we'll look at that as well. If you want real interest rates at 1%, we'll look at that. So it's an apolitical offer of support, okay, and it's just so that any manifesto commitments are grounded in a bit more evidence. And then whenever the election is called, whether that be the first week in May or whether it be September or October, we're going to basically look at the manifestos in each of the home nations, and we're going to do a compare and contrast and see who are the winners and losers in each of those. And it's really important to say that, anything we present, it's not our policies, it's not our suggestion for the way that a higher education system should work. That's up to the people of the particular country through the elected representatives that they elect in a general election. So First point to note is that the higher education systems in each of the 4 home nations have diverged significantly as a result of devolution. So Northern Ireland essentially is still on plan 1 in terms of repayment. There's essentially relatively low fees that are funded by loans, and there's relatively high teaching grants, but also student number controls as a result of that. There's an export of a large number of Northern Irish students to GB, we know of. In terms of HEI income, it's low to moderate, okay, per student, and we're going to come to this, and some of our analysis has been pointed out about teaching grant and how we need to revise the numbers, and that's fine, and we will do that. But in terms of the balance and contribution between the Exchequer and the student, it's about 50-50. In Wales, which essentially had the system that Northern Ireland has up to the Diamond Review of Higher Education Wales, when they changed it fundamentally. And they took essentially the massive tuition fee grant that was available, non-means tested, and they put all of that non-means tested tuition fee grant into means tested maintenance grants. And they essentially, Wales has the most generous student support system in the UK. There are high fees, and thankfully, or we really did appreciate it, but the day after we published our report, the Welsh Government raised fees by £250, which was fantastic. The higher education institutions have a medium or reasonable level of income per student, and essentially the level of contribution between students and the Exchequer is about 50-50. In Scotland, there's essentially very low fees of £1,820 per student per annum, written off essentially with a tuition fee grant covering the total amount. There's very high teaching grants in Scotland, and there are also student number controls. Essentially, the entire system is paid for by the public purse, and HEI income is very low. It's much lower than in England in particular. England, they've moved away from grants of any description. NHS bursaries are gone by the wayside, maintenance grants gone, all replaced with loans. The result of this is that essentially HEIs, even though there's a 9250 fee, are well funded, and the best funded anywhere in the UK. The level of contribution, the balance of contribution between the Exchequer and individuals, it's very heavily weighted in favour of students. Students and graduates pay a very large proportion of the cost of higher education. Ongoing challenges, fiscal constraints, we don't need to mention that. One of the problems that all countries within the UK face is the lack of economic growth over the last decade is responsible for poor wages, poor standards of living. Essentially, they should be higher than they are, and essentially the cost of higher education systems is higher than it would otherwise be. There are low fees and low unit of resource, and with inflation, this is eroding day by day, or 10% per year, approximately. There are student number controls in Northern Ireland. This is really problematic. The export of young talent to GB is not necessarily a good thing for the economy of Northern Ireland, I would suggest. And I say that as somebody who left Republic of Ireland 30 years ago and never went back. Mind you, they might be happy. But anyway, the policy environment and international students is a real issue. So the government is clamping down on international students, and that affects everyone. You know, the removal or the tightening of post-study work visas in the graduate route, deeply problematic. It's also going to create a very, it has a direct effect on HEI income, but it also has an indirect effect as institutions start competing against each other, okay, for domestic students. And then the last one is political constraints and public understanding. There's a real dichotomy between the general public's understanding of the higher education fees and funding system and how political parties sell policies. Classic example is there might be, it sounds great to say that there are free fees. You know, we're going to introduce free fees. It sounds like a great policy, but if you reword the question or reword the statement and say we're going to offer a massive middle class subsidy, it doesn't sound so great, okay? And most people wouldn't agree with that. Okay, so what are we going to do today? We're going to talk about the current Northern Irish funding system and the impact on the Exchequer, students, graduates, and higher education institutions. And then I'm going to sort of do a little more detail on the comparison between England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. And Mike is going to take over and ask the question, what would the adoption of the English fee system in Northern Ireland look like? And it's just a fee system. It's nothing to do with the repayment system. and what would the adoption of free fees in Northern Ireland look like? Who are the winners and losers? So, the current funding system in Northern Ireland. So the first thing is, in Northern Ireland, it's a really complex system. Probably more complicated than any other country in the UK, we would suggest. So tuition fees, 47.10 per full-time student studying in Northern Ireland, 9,250 elsewhere. Fee loans for full-time students, a combination of means-tested fee grants and fee loans for part-time students. Means-tested maintenance loans up to 8,136 for students living away from home outside of London. And then some means-tested maintenance grants for part-time students, but they're really, really small. Repayment threshold, so Plan 1, this is still Plan 1. Repayment threshold 22,015, 9% over that threshold, no real rate of interest, 25-year repayment. So 25-year repayment, it's 40 years in England, it's 30 years in Wales, 30 years in Scotland. No real rate of interest, except in Wales, 3%. Thresholds, 25 in England, frozen, 22 in Northern Ireland, uprated with inflation. It's 27.6 in Scotland, uprated with inflation. It's 27,295 in Wales. I mean, it's all different. I mean, it's like a little game of bingo. This is Plan 1, Scotland's Plan 4, England's Plan 5, Wales is Plan 2 plus, the new Plan 2, and they're having serious questions about what to do next. I'm going to keep going here, but when we model the cohort of students starting the qualifications in Northern Ireland, NI domicile students in Northern Ireland, we also include Republic of Ireland students in Northern Ireland. We exclude nursing students because it's a different funding pot. And we base this analysis on the best data that we had available. Okay, and quite honestly, it's been pointed out that some of our numbers are incorrect in terms of teaching grant in particular. Okay, that we've underestimated the teaching grant. We didn't have that information available. We weren't able to get it from publicly available data sources. Very kindly, a couple of people have suggested to work with us to improve the numbers, and we're going to go away and do that immediately after this discussion. And I suppose that's why we do research. It's an open forum. Where there's improvements to be made, we will make improvements. The really important thing to remember, though, is whatever the numbers in the baseline, when Micah starts, it's really important to remember that, essentially everything is going to change, both the baseline. Once we do change the numbers, it's important to look at the differences between the baseline and whatever the scenario is, okay? Because everything is going to move. When we change the baseline, everything else is going to move in the same direction. So, based on these numbers, though, the cost of putting a cohort of students through the system is about 172 million. It's an underestimate. About 90 million in teaching grant, that's an underestimate. 40 million in maintenance grants, about 20 million in loans. Institutions receive about 335 million, and the average debt in graduation is about £30,000, with repayments being 31,000 or 23,000, depending on whether it's male or female graduate. Put that in comparison, a typical graduate in a full-time undergraduate student in England will graduate with about 50,000 in debt. However, look at the repayments. So the repayments are flat. So whether you're on the second decile of lifetime earnings as a male graduate, you will pay the exact same, essentially, as a male graduate on the 9th decile. It's regressive, essentially. So you can think of people like teachers around the 2nd, 3rd, 4th decile. So they will pay the same in repayments for their degree as somebody on the 9th decile. I'm not going to say an economist, an accountant or a lawyer. I'm going to pick on them today. In the same way with nurses, for instance, let's say it's a predominantly female profession, nurses, or teachers, female teachers, they would be on the 5th decile of female earnings. So they are paying the same, essentially, in repayments as somebody on the 9th decile. Okay. And this highlights the effect of not having any real interest rates. If you charge real interest rates, you basically hold the higher earners in the system for longer and they pay more. So having real interest rates basically stops this guillotine effect. Okay, it's an interesting thing. Okay, a little bit more about the different home nations. And I stress that the numbers for Northern Ireland at the bottom, they should be a little bit higher. Okay, so well, I'm just going to focus on a couple of things here. So the level, and we look at ratios, the level of funding, public funding in Northern Ireland for students, NI domiciled students in NI, is about 3 times as much as in England, for an English home student studying in England. In Scotland, the level of public investment is 5 times higher in Scotland than in England. Okay? In Wales, the level of public investment is about twice that of England, okay, per student per annum. Okay, so there's wildly different levels of public investment in higher education. In Wales, you can see, I mean, this is driven essentially by the very, very generous maintenance grants. All of this money is maintenance grants, essentially. In Scotland, 80% of that is T grant, the teaching grant going to universities directly. About 20% is the free fee, essentially, maybe a bit more. Northern Ireland has a very balanced system, okay, and we'll come back to that in a little bit. But in terms of funding per higher education institution, in England, the level of funding is about 10,200. In Northern Ireland, we've got 7.6. It is a little bit higher than that. There's no doubt about that. So we've underestimated. So it's probably about 10 to 15% lower than in England. It's probably broadly comparable to the level of funding per student in Wales. Okay? But you can sort of see between Wales and Northern Ireland, they're very different systems, but some of the outcomes are quite similar. So the distributional effects are very different between Northern Ireland and Wales. In Scotland, and unequivocally the case, the level of funding or resources per student in HEIs is much lower than in England. And we all, I mean, if you've been to Scotland recently, any institution will sort of say what sort of pressure they're under in terms of finances. In terms of the balance of contribution, this is all students. So Northern Ireland is 50-50 in terms of balance of contribution. It's probably a little bit higher. It's probably closer to 56-44 once we redo the analysis. In Wales, it's 44-56. In England, students, graduates contribute about 1/6 of the cost of higher education. And in Scotland, it's actually 113%. It's slightly, artificial, these numbers. Obviously, most football managers will say that their players gave it 110%. Here we have the equivalent. It's 113% because if you think about just fees, okay, the Scottish government contributes about 96% of the fee. About 4% of the fee is contributed through loans taken out by Scottish domicile students in England and repaid. So it's a very small proportion. Once you add in the maintenance grants, the write-offs associated with maintenance loans, it actually means that Scottish students are being paid to attend higher education. Now, that might reflect the will of the people, and we have no issue with that, but we just want, so the whole point of this analysis is just want people to understand the consequences of the decisions that are made. So with that, I'm getting, dagger marks from people at the back of the room, so I'm going to hand over to Micah. My apologies.
Thank you, Gavin. All right, so Gavin has taken us across the UK. I'm now going to bring everyone back to Northern Ireland, and we're going to get into some quite extreme scenarios here in terms of fees. So we're going to look at the absolute extreme of raising fees to what the English system is. Then I'm going to show as a second scenario what would happen under completely free fees in Northern Ireland. So we're showing exactly, as Gavin said, to exemplify what different changes to the system actually mean to students and graduates, but also the Exchequer. So, as Gavin mentioned, there's been lots of debate, of course, about what's the right level of fee to charge to students. It's all about the price tag, the sticker price of higher education in terms of the tuition fees. One option that has been floated in Northern Ireland, it's one of the options that's essentially discussed in all of the home nations, is what would happen if you implemented the English fees. You can see it's just happened in Wales. They've just increased their fees from the £9,000 to £9,250. So Wales is now fully on par with the English system. So that's what we show here. Implementing the English fees for Republic of Ireland students studying in Northern Ireland and Northern Irish students studying in Northern Ireland, so home students. And that would involve essentially 4 major changes to the current system. So the first is, of course, increase in the sticker price. So essentially almost a doubling in tuition fees from the current $4,710 to $9,250 per full-time students. And we do a pro rata increase as well for part-time students. The second key change is that under the current system in Northern Ireland, of course, the fees increase over time, which is a very positive part of the system, because in all other home nations, they are very much frozen, and they have been for a very long time. So here we would have frozen fees as in England, because the 9,250 hasn't changed in many years. In terms of student support as well, the third key change is that the fee increase would be backed by a corresponding increase in tuition fee loans for both full-time and part-time students. So the fee loan would rise from 4,710 to 9,250 per full-time student. The only sort of small support element that we do keep in the current system is the current part-time fee grant, so that £820 per student, depending on household income. And then finally, to fully mimic the English system, we reduce our assumed teaching grant paid to Northern Irish HEIs by the DFE, and we reduce that to what the OFS currently pays and to English HEIs in terms of home students studying in England. So this is a reduction of about £3,000, as Gavin said, an underestimate to about £700 per student that's currently given by the OFS. Very importantly, we assume absolutely no changes to repayment terms, so we will not impose the auger system, the crazy auger repayment system that's just been implemented in England. That would be a bad idea. And we also assume there's absolutely no changes for Northern Irish domiciled students studying in the rest of the UK. So let's look first of all at the overall cost implications of implementing that. So here, our entire analysis focuses on the 23-24 cohort. So essentially what we do here is what would happen if you implemented that fee system, that English fee system for that cohort. So our grey column is the baseline, that's the current system that Gavin presented, and then the second column is what happens under the English fee system. And you can see there will be quite substantial Exchequer cost savings associated with that, from a cost of about 172 million down to 135 million. So 37 million per cohort saving is about 21% cost saving to the Exchequer. And what's happening here is essentially the reduced cost, the cost saving of lowering the teaching grants. That cost saving is far larger than the additional loan write-offs that would have to be made because of the higher fee loans that would be given to students here. You can see this in the RAP charge as well. The RAP charge increases slightly because of the higher fee loan outlay overall. So it increases from the 10% that Gavin mentioned to about 13.8%, so a 3.8 percentage point increase. Very importantly, HEIs would of course have a very significant benefit from this policy because of the very significant additional fee income, and that would far outweigh the very significant reduction in teaching grants. So gross fee income, the additional fee income would exceed the reduction in teaching grants. So it's a 59 million per cohort estimated additional benefit to higher education institutions. Again, this is only for Northern Irish HEIs. So again, we make no changes for HEIs in the rest of the UK. And as Gavin mentioned, there's a substantial amount of students, of course, from Northern Ireland that study elsewhere throughout the UK. In terms of the very bottom of the slide, so you can see average debt on graduation would, of course, increase quite substantially by about £13,500. And this is entirely, again, driven by the fact that the fee loan would essentially double, almost double. And also average lifetime repayments would increase substantially for both men and women. But very importantly, as we get on the next slide, not everyone will be affected by this. Not everyone will be worse off. So in this slide, you can barely see it, but there's some candle charts, essentially. You can see the little dots, and that is the current system. That's this flat repayment system that Gavin showed earlier. So that's the current system. And then the darker bars is what happens if you impose the English fee system and the English fee loans onto Northern Irish domiciled students. So you can see for middle and high income graduates, so it's second decile and up for men and sixth decile and up for women, there's some very substantial increases in repayments. And that is of course driven by the fact that the fee loan here has doubled. So it's a much larger loan balance, and therefore graduates are kept in repayment for much longer, therefore repay their loans much later than under the current system. Very, very importantly, though, you can see graduates at the lower end of the income distribution. So, for example, first decile men, first lifetime income decile, are completely unaffected by this policy. And that is because they're currently already not expected to ever fully repay the fee loan plus maintenance loan balance by the end of the 25-year repayment period. And it's partially driven by the fact that the repayment period in Northern Ireland is only 25 years, as opposed to, as Gavin said, 30 or 40 in other home nations. So because they're already not expected to ever fully repay the current loan levels, an increase on those loan levels wouldn't affect them. That's a very important part of this policy. You can see it would overall make the system would continue to be regressive, but slightly less regressive than currently. Okay, let's talk about free fees. I just said that implementing full English fees in Northern Ireland would have no impact on the very lowest earning graduates. The same thing applies if you fully remove tuition fees. That's very, very important. In general, changes in tuition fees and the impact of that, that's one of the most widely misunderstood aspects of higher education funding systems. So as you'll see, let's go to the other extreme. So here, instead of doubling the fees, we completely take them away. So we model an effective fee-free system in Northern Ireland. Again, it's only for home students studying in Northern Ireland, no change for students studying anywhere else in the UK. This is essentially the Sinn Féin option of fully free fees. What we do here is an effective free fee system. So we do what's currently been done in Scotland. So we would keep the 4,710 fee level, but instead of that being supported by a fee loan, we fully replace the fee loan with an entire fee grant paid by the Exchequer. And that can obviously, that free fee system can be done in multiple ways. It can also be done in terms of the notional fee being completely abolished and the teaching grants therefore being increased accordingly. It's essentially, we just model what the Scottish system is. So we model a fee grant and notional fees charged to students. Again, very important, we assume absolutely no other changes here to the current system. So the fees would increase over time as they currently do. We assume no changes to teaching grants or anything else. And again, there's also absolutely no change to fee support for students studying in the rest of the UK. Let's get into cost implications. As you can imagine, this policy is very costly from the Exchequer perspective. So the cost would here increase by more than 70%. So from 172 million to 292 million, 121 million pound increase per cohort. So very, very substantial, purely because essentially the current fee loan write-offs and maintenance loan write-offs are relatively low. So as soon as you start replacing that with a full grant, whatever you do, that cost will look very, very expensive compared to the current system because the RAP charge is currently only around 10%. You can see here the RAP charge would decrease by only about 1.2 percentage points to 8.8%, and the RAP charge of course remains because maintenance loans are still in the system. So it's still a loan system, it's just not a fee loan system anymore here. Higher education institutions would see almost no impact. What we have assumed here is because of free fees, they would no longer be obliged to provide bursaries to students. So that's a small saving essentially here in our modeling of 3 million associated with the cohort, but no effect otherwise. The bottom, of course, once you remove fees, debt on graduation will go down very significantly by about £14,500. Average lifetime repayments will also decrease very significantly, but again, very importantly, not everyone will benefit from this policy. So let's look at these distributional impacts in more detail. Again, the candle charts, you can now see them a lot more properly. The candle charts is the current system, and you can see it's essentially the opposite effect of increasing fees, of doubling fees if you completely remove them. So for most graduates, of course, the repayments are substantially reduced as a result of the removal of fee loans here. So they now have a much smaller loan balance, which is repaid much more quickly, and they benefit overall. But the key thing here is the very lowest earning graduates, so you can see women on the third decile and below, are again completely unaffected. So even if you just gave them maintenance loans and they wouldn't have to repay a fee loan balance, their earnings are so low that within the 25 years they would never fully repay that amount. And that's again a really important aspect of what happens under different types of changes to the fees. It's often very, very misunderstood and very non-intuitive if you really think about it. Essentially what you can say here is the removal of fees is effectively a middle class subsidy. It doesn't affect the lowest earners. That's one of the key issues of these free fee systems. Okay, I've talked everyone very much down. It's not going to get any better. Essentially, higher education fees and funding is at a crossroads across all home nations in the UK, but there are particularly large issues, or particularly big issues, of course, in Northern Ireland itself. There's been lots of debate over what's the right level of fee to be charged to home students. Should that be free? Should it be 9,250? Should it be as current? Many, many options are obviously being discussed. As we've seen from Gavin's part of the presentation, higher education resources have a relatively limited amount of resource per home student. Again, we will come back to those numbers. But the fact remains that the public cost of the system is very, very large indeed. The combination of these low fees and the high teaching grants means that there are, of course, student number controls, and they severely limit essentially the economy because it's an economic handbrake on the Northern Ireland economy because so many students leave to acquire higher education elsewhere and never return or return only much later in life. In addition to all of that, in addition to the limited HEI resource and the high public funding, maintenance support under the Northern Irish system is really quite low compared to other home nations. It's by far the lowest, and especially there's almost no maintenance funding, for example, for part-time students in the system. So that's another issue. Essentially, students themselves are relatively underfunded. At the same time as all of this, we come to the middle part. Obviously, there are very severe, significant pressures on public sector budgets at the moment, and it's particularly pertinent in all home nations, but also in Northern Ireland, of course. So there's recently been a 16% real terms decline in the DFE budget in 23-24 alone. That's, of course, very, very bad news. We'll see what happens once the full UK budget comes out next week, but it's probably not going to be very good news. And governments are facing increasingly difficult decisions on how to allocate this very limited resource and this ever declining resource, effectively, that is available to government. So what are the policy options? As Gavin said, none of what we propose here is the perfect solution. Essentially, all of this research basically just says there are a wide range of policy options. You can see how complicated the systems are. There are a wide range of policy options and changes you can make to the systems, but all of them need to be thought through really, really carefully ahead of the general election. As you've seen, even small seeming changes can have really, really large impacts on the system. And the winners and losers from different changes to the system are really counterintuitive and really not very well understood. So the short-term sticking plasters that are often applied to these systems are really problematic. And on that very cheery note, thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, Micah and Gavin. So we're going to move to, I'll just get out of the way, we're going to move to a short period of questions. So if you do have a question, please put up your hand and we'll come to you. I've got a mic here, and then we've got one other roaming mic at the back. I would just say, please, if you could keep your questions relatively short and do speak right into the microphone. It might be that it can be heard in the room, but we want to make sure we pick it up on the recording, so do make sure that you speak into the microphone. So do we have any questions on anything that Micah and Gavin have said? There could be any kind of questions, clarifying statements or sort of provocations, because you've proposed a couple of very interesting sort of different proposals there. Well, we've got two here. Let's come here, and I'll come in, and then we can get one microphone at the back as well. Yes.
It's not so much a question as a comment. In your earlier various slides, you don't show what proportion of the age group decide to enter higher education, because it's the numbers of graduates who are going to go into the economy, which is very much in the mind of the politicians. So really, until we know how much these various funding formulae deter students from entering higher education, we can't really, it's a missing part of any sort of analysis.
Fantastic, thank you. And we'll take one more at the back, and then we'll answer those as a pair.
Yeah, I was also going to say that it's funny how that we see these things sometimes as costs rather than investments, which is perhaps how we feel about it within the university. I just wanted you could clear this up for me. I'm not quite clear how this works. When you're looking at these systems, how much of a hole does it leave in different governments' exchequers that the loans are not being repaid? Well, how does that? Because that's sort of when we're looking whether a system's working or not. If you're telling the electorate that we're doing it, it's not costing us anything, but in actual fact, a bigger black hole is growing. Then that's another argument for a system not working. I'm not sure how it works, but if you could explain that, that'd be great.
Yeah, of course. So in terms of the effect essentially of these policy changes on the number of students, that's a very good point. So we're not sort of social researchers that really know how any of these options would affect the number of students coming into the system. So all of these are very much static. We don't really know how much free fees would increase the number of students coming in, but also what that would have to do to student number controls, because it's a very, very large cost to the system again. So it's a very good point that we can't really say what different options will do to the general student population, also in terms of demographics, in terms of different age groups. In England, of course, the lifelong learning entitlement is a huge policy that's currently being discussed, which would address some of this difference in demographics over time and different age groups entering the system, but absolutely appreciate the comment. I think that makes a lot of sense. In terms of what it does to Exchequer budgets, so there's, it used to be called the fiscal illusion of student loans from the Treasury perspective, and it's changed recently. So previously it was the case that the public deficit would essentially show the whole loan balance in surplus for the entire, almost the entire 25-year period, because there would be almost no loan write-off. So the entire time, the loans would not be considered an expenditure. That doesn't count. It's only the interest payments that come in, which used to be, well, are now very high actually because of retail price index being so high. And then after 25 years, the full loan write-off would all of a sudden hit. But for 25 years, the loans look quite favorable to the Exchequer. What has now happened, that was called the smoke and mirrors policy. So they have been pulled up on that by the European Commission actually at the time. And now it's essentially a part of the loan balance that is expected to be written off. Once the loan is given to students, that is counted immediately as expenditure. And that's a very different change now. Essentially, only part of the loan is now counted as being of benefit to the Exchequer. So there's still a part that's being repaid, where interest will accumulate, but there's also a large chunk that is written off at the beginning. Again, because the rep charge is relatively low, especially for Northern Ireland, that might not be a very significant chunk. But it has changed very, very significantly. It's also the case that obviously the way that student loans feed into government accounts is very different, because it's not necessarily counted as a Northern Irish budget line. It's very much given by the Westminster government to Northern Ireland, as long as the loan repayment systems are relatively on par. From my understanding, the way that actually the system feeds into the Northern Irish budget is everything that's grant funded is the Northern Irish budget line, and everything that's loan funded is an English or a Westminster government budget line that comes through. Yeah. Anything for you?
Yeah, I mean, I've got 2 points. This is for Dr. Hudson, and I know the name of everyone because I wrote the badges. So the point about whether like having a high fee level is a deterrent effect on participation in higher education, it's free at the point of entry. I mean, what we've found and what we've seen is the removal of maintenance support is the biggest deterrent to participation in higher education. When the NHS bursary was removed in, I think it was 2017-18, essentially this was, and replaced with loans, this was an effective 70% increase in the price of undertaking nursing qualifications. And lo and behold, a year and a half later, nobody entered nursing. And we have like shocking shortages of nurses in the NHS, partly as a result of that. In terms of this sort of question about do we have too many graduates, or is there going to be a black hole, or you talk about cost and investment. I completely agree with you. I think having a more highly qualified population is the biggest source of economic growth that an economy can possibly have. Investment in human capital infrastructure. That's just it. So the more graduates we have, and the more highly qualified people we have, whether it be academic or vocationally qualified, that is better for the economy, full stop. And if you think about the productivity puzzle that the UK is facing, we did a piece of work for the Department for Education in Westminster, and the whole point was, if we didn't have such a highly qualified population, the productivity puzzle would be in an even worse state. It doesn't look great, but could be a lot worse. So we need graduates. We also need people with high levels of competencies in vocational qualifications and trades and apprenticeships as well, for sure.
Fantastic, thank you both. We probably have time for just one more question if anyone's got an absolutely burning question to ask Gavin and Micah. Otherwise, we'll move to, seeing none, we'll move to the panel. So if you wouldn't mind, please, taking your seats up at the front. So our panel are going to have, in a moment, they're going to have 5 minutes each. They're going to be presenting their responses to what we've all just heard. Before that, I'm going to give them just a very brief introduction so that you know who you're hearing from. So we're very, very fortunate to have a fantastic panel today. We've got, and this is unfortunately not in the order that they're sat, but we have John Darcy, OBE, who's the Open University's National Director for Ireland since 2010. Before joining the Open University, he was the CEO of Colleges Northern Ireland, and he also was awarded an OBE for services to education and the arts in 2020. We have Chloe Ferguson, who is a campaigner and activist dedicated to making tertiary education accessible for everyone. Chloe is the current NUS-USI president and the official spokesperson for over 130,000 students across further and higher education. Previously, Chloe held the position VP Campaigns and Engagement in Queen's Students' Union. We have Professor Paul Bartholomew, who's the Vice-Chancellor at Ulster University. So Paul previously had a clinical career in the NHS as a diagnostic radiographer. Before moving into higher education, he's a Principal Fellow at the Higher Education Academy, a National Teaching Fellow, and a Fellow at the Academy of Social Sciences. Fourthly, we have Mark Lee. Mark has been covering the Director of Higher Education role at the Department for the Economy since autumn 2022. He's also the Director for Tertiary Education Reform and has been leading work across the department looking at inclusive growth. He previously also worked in Whitehall in what is now the Department for Levelling Up, Housing and Communities. And finally, we have Dr. Ryan Feeney, who's the Vice President of Strategic Engagement and External Affairs at Queen's University Belfast. He's been in various roles at Queen's since 2016. He was previously Director of Strategic Communications and Engagement for the Police Service of Northern Ireland for 3 years. So what we're going to do is we're going to hear from each of you, and I'd ask you, please, if you could keep these to just to 5 minutes. There will be a chance for questions later. We'll be able to elaborate on anything you don't quite get time for. Could we start, please? We'll go in the order that I read you out. So could we start with John?
Thanks very much, Josh, and thanks for the invitation to be here. Although the context for the current reports is forthcoming general election in the UK, I think the publication is very important for us at the moment in Northern Ireland with the return of the Executive and obviously the appointment of Conor Murphy, MLA, as Economy Minister. At the Open University, we believe it's an important report to, I suppose, kickstart, although it's been started a long time, this conversation about fees and funding, but it does need another kick, about how universities are funded here so that we can play our full part in revitalising Northern Ireland economically, socially and fairly. And I'm sure as my colleagues on the panel will agree, a key piece of work in the Minister's in-tray will be to consider fees and funding for higher education. The importance of higher education to the Minister's recently published economic vision with its 4 guiding principles of good jobs, regional balance, productivity and reducing carbon emissions is clear. And of course the benefits of higher education extend right across the Executive and all of the departments are there. So getting a sustainable funding model that meets the needs of providers and also meets the needs of students is vitally important. Given the skills agenda, the aspiration for good jobs and productivity, we need to be real about the required quantum of highly skilled people, both in existing jobs and in the new job roles that are going to be created over time. The UK's and Northern Ireland's skill shortages are more extensive among the existing workforce than new entrants into the job market, so there's a very definite balance that we need to strike. Part-time higher education provision through flexible supported online learning, I got the marketing quote in there as you can see, from organisations like the Open University. We currently account for around about 59% of part-time HE in universities here at undergraduate level. But also routes to higher education qualifications are vital to the economy as well. So there's an important role for our further education colleges and university colleges to play there as well. And while part-time study is included in some of the modelling, it's very much on the margins of this work with a much tighter focus on the full-time scenario. And that's very understandable to an extent given the caps that currently exist for full-time higher education here. And as you've mentioned, the boats and planes that take many of our young people across to England, Scotland and Wales each year. Just before the Assembly elections in 2022, which seems like a lifetime ago, we launched a Future is Flexible manifesto at Stormont, which got great buy-in from all the political parties, and the asks at that time are still very valid today. They were, for example, a statutory right to lifelong learning. That's not the lifelong loan entitlement, but a statutory right to lifelong learning. And there have been some developments over the last couple of years which show the appetite amongst citizens here to upskill. You know, 3 universities, 2 university colleges and 6 FE colleges played an important role in the delivery of the department and the Northern Ireland Office's Skills Up programme, which showed that there was a real desire for short, focused, high-level skills, and that could be built on through, for example, an entitlement. Not surprisingly, we asked for a sustainable higher education funding model, and I'm sure Ryan and Paul will present strong arguments from the full-time sector, but making part-time flexible HE more meaningfully accessible is really vital for us at this time. Part-time students tend to be older. They tend to have commitments, caring responsibilities. Many of them have disabilities. And as you said, Micah, they don't get access to maintenance support, which is a big thing that we need to address. And of course, the third one was a prioritisation in the investment in skills. So we were calling for ring-fence funding to assist providers in getting high-level skills out to people that need them. And finally, we need to be mindful of the unintended consequences of key policy change. There's a recent example from England which saw a catastrophic decline in part-time higher education there when student fees were increased a decade ago. And I'm glad that Nick Hillman's in the audience now, because I was going to ask your permission for this quote, but I'm just going to go with it. Nick said that the collapse in part-time study is arguably the single biggest problem facing higher education at the moment. If we succeed in reversing the decline in part-time study, the benefits to employers in terms of improved productivity and to the economy in terms of faster growth will be substantial, but the benefits to individuals and their families will be even more transformative. So Josh, I'll finish there.
Fantastic, thanks very much. Can we hear now from Chloe?
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone, and thank you so much for having us today. I suppose just to set a wee bit of framing about how I'm going to come about this and how NUSUSI comes about this as the National Students' Union, covering both further and higher education, is that our response is very much grounded in lifting students out of this poverty line, ensuring students have support during cost of living crisis, during what was the pandemic, during what's now been named as the new recession, and for future years going forward. The findings of this is really put into focus a higher education system that is fundamentally not just working for students, but talking about those unintended consequences, also not working for staff 9 times out of 10 who service it. And it's showing a higher education funding system, completely in agree, urgent need of reform, but there is no simple solution to this problem. We reflected on Northern Ireland's position within this, and there really is no simple solution. And when we're talking about winners and losers, really it's going to be coming down to a balance sheet of how can we get the best probable solution for everyone involved. But taking a step back, you can see the whole education system, we're trying to call it a bit more of an ecosystem now within the North, needs to be worked not just undergraduate to full-time students, but part-time students, as you were saying, further education students, apprentices and postgraduate students as well, who, talking about that maintenance piece, often don't get access to the funding that is needed to be available. Some might argue today that students won't feel that pound in a pocket impact of an increase in tuition fees, and it's an argument we hear time and time again. And it's really interesting to see some of that data come through, that students won't really notice any real financial impact, and that we can use that increased income to put it back into student experience. But this approach ignores the reality that student poverty has become so normalised and ingrained within our funding system here that we can't take this in silos, and that an inflation of fees would just heap more debt on. We're talking about a lifelong debt, not lifelong learning, when we consider some of the issues that are being shown to us today. Debt perception itself acts as a structural barrier, particularly for students from low-income backgrounds, restricting their participation in higher education and adding fuel to the fire of our brain drain that we have seen from, I'm sure panellists will touch on as well, is a much-needed issue that needs to be tackled. The current funding system is just not working for students and those within that. Taking, for instance, maintenance loans themselves, which is that incurring of debt again. Looking at the current system, despite that 40% and some would say welcome increase in maintenance loans for the 2023-24 year for Northern Ireland, the maintenance loan system still leaves students struggling for money. And our current system also feeds this social inequality, with graduates on the lower end of socioeconomic skills, as mentioned there, paying back some more over a 25-year period in student loan repayments than some of our highest earners. Some of you may have seen that NUSUSI launched a cost of living report over the last few weeks, highlighting some of the student struggles that are here today, whether that is those in college, whether that is those who are walking the halls of Queen's today or in Ulster, and some from Open University as well. And what really was shown through that is that 84% of students are worried about money now. And if we're going to look at reworking this system that provides students the support to engage in learning no matter what age they are, we need to also look that they're able to support themselves throughout that system to actually engage in learning. They need nutrition, they need their tools, they need the hidden costs tackled. And so taking a step back and looking at this report and looking at the evidence, it's so important that when we're taking these considerations, we talk about those unintended impacts, we talk about access, we talk about widening participation. Some of the results were truly shocking, with 3 in 5 students who working in excess of 20 hours per week. And for international students, there's a 20-hour lock on their visa, so they can't actually work any more than that, even when they're desperately in need of that income. Any debate on HE funding reform needs to take an honest look at these harsh realities of the student experience. We need to attack this debate with a funding reform from a culture and a holistic lens. Simply tinkering around the edges or potentially looking at putting the English system in place, which the speakers did emulate, is not going to be the solution that works here for the people within Northern Ireland. And in this debate, we often miss out that wider context, as I was talking about before, of the further education or the skills agenda. If we are to realise this cultural lifelong learning, as set out by the 10X skills strategy, the current strategy within NI, it's important to harmonise across the further and higher education system, where learners can choose the pathway that is right for them. The UK currently has some of the highest fees of the world, with the notable exception being Scotland, as we worked in there, that removed tuition fees for all Scottish undergraduate students in 2008. A report by Esri on student mobility published last September found this acted as a significant incentive for Scottish students to study locally as a solution to that brain drain. And prior to 2020-2021, when the fee exemption was removed for students from the south of Ireland, also encouraged students from the south of Ireland to study there. Just touching quickly on the need for high-skilled graduates, I completely agree, but within, we look at the job labour market right now, and we're looking at skill shortages, which was touched on. It's actually that missing middle qualification of levels 3 to 5 that is actually so in need right now within our economies to fulfil those skill shortages within businesses. And so for us to actually address the shortfalls of our education system as a whole in Northern Ireland and taking that holistic view, we need to be looking at this with further education also in mind. Tuition fees were not always a thing, and we know that some promises have been failed of the opportunities that were meant to be given to students within Northern Ireland. The focus now needs to be on the urgent intervention and support to students, and our future can look incredibly bleak. We've got the cost of living crisis, we've had a health crisis, the crisis in the NHS, the mental health crisis, the housing crisis, the climate crisis. It's a crisis generation that's just stirring and stirring and stirring with not a lot of hope to be gone. This can be, as mentioned within the modelling, a bit of a political question. It can be, what do we want for the people of Northern Ireland? What do we want education to mean? Do we want it to mean opportunity? Do we want it to symbolise something of hope, where it's an opportunity to grow and it's an accessible thing? Or do we want it to mean something that actually is just for the few and not for the many? We need to end student poverty and support students in the here and now. And only by putting students at the centre of this argument, and also those who never see education as an actual option in themselves, can we build an education system which is truly lifelong and accessible. Thanks.
Thank you, Chloe. Paul.
Thank you very much. And I agree with quite a lot of what's been said, but in some ways I think we need to come back to basics. I think it starts with politics. These are political questions, and we need government to be bold enough to do the right thing and not the popular thing. And when I say not the popular thing, I mean not necessarily popular with students, not necessarily popular with universities, but the right thing for Northern Ireland. And the right thing has two components. It's the thing that is going to give, if you like, the most optimal outcome, but it's the most optimal outcome within the realistic context of how much money there is. I don't think anybody believes that, you know, the budget for health is going to be cut to give money to students or into students' pockets or to universities. I'm slightly alarmed by one of the slides that says, you know, if we were to introduce fees, it would give institutions another, you know, £56 million, 18% uplift. I don't really believe that's the case at all. I think there's a pretty vast underestimation of the teaching grant at the moment. You've put up 7,600. I actually think by our calculations, it's about, I was going to say about, and give a figure that's 9,116. So there isn't that sort of differential, and I've been doing a lot of meetings with politicians around the country saying that if we were to introduce fees, universities would not be better off. Who would be better off would be the Department of the Economy, who would actually have money to, I think, put money in students' pockets for the maintenance payments that we really need for all those reasons. I really agree with both of our previous speakers about, you know, just looking at the undergraduate population here is extraordinarily partial. The crash of part-time is a crisis. It's a crisis of opportunity. It's a crisis in productivity. It's highly problematic. I accept everything that's said in terms of putting up fees and what that means in terms of indebtedness. And I think that the sound-bitedness that we see that comes out in this, it belies huge complexity, much more complex actually than is in your papers and so forth. If we overlap with some of the market dynamics, who's not going into higher education, who might, what's the elasticity of demand? What's the elasticity of demand compared to the price point or the perceived price point when you're looking at perceptions of debt and so forth, are all questions that you know, we might want to try to answer. But in the end, how much money do we have? And the amount of money that we have is the amount of money that gets allocated through the Department of the Economy, and we have to think how to optimise that. I'm not going out there saying, oh, it's the wrong amount, we need to up it. At the moment, I've been, you know, with my colleagues at Queen's, I've been in meetings and I've been very, very clear that I think we just need to try to hold on to what we've got and not go out and look like we're blind to austerity measures, that in somehow universities are a particular special case that we need more. I just don't think that's going to wash it or cut it, but I think that we do have to admit that we do a really good job. Both universities have huge efficiency levels, you know, 7, 8 to 1 in terms of every pound you get in, the value to the economy, then that's a good investment, and we should continue with that. I think the Welsh model of all the ones is a pretty good model that does see an increase in student fees, but at the real cost. We just got to change some of the language about this stuff. You know, to say that it's a debt burden for students when actually it's a debt burden for the student's loan company that gets picked up through participation in a system is very different from tolerating, and we really shouldn't tolerate the language that it's in any way student debt when it isn't student debt. The notion that it's a student debt frightens people, and it makes people think that it's real debt. A figure that's not on there, and I'd be really interested, and it seems to be really different. I came from England into here. There seems to be this real thing in Northern Ireland. I've spoken to a whole bunch of parents who immediately sought to pay off student debt. And I'm like, why? Why would you do that? You know, and yet in Northern Ireland seems to be a much higher propensity to say, must pay off the debt, must pay off the debt, must pay off the debt. When actually that's not how the system's supposed to work. The system takes into account you don't really need to pay it off. Just let it run through and let the figures do its thing. And if you do that, it can be highly progressive. And it was designed to be highly progressive. So I think we do need to put it down to basics. How much money have we got? That's already, I think, defined by the budget. What's the best bang per buck that we can have? And that's about doing the right thing for Northern Ireland, not the popular thing for universities, not the popular thing for students, but the right thing for Northern Ireland.
Fantastic, Paul, thank you. And I think that alludes to a lot of the complexity of many of the things that we're grappling with in this conversation. Let's go now to Mark, please.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. So, yeah, as Director of Higher Education, up until a few weeks ago, myself and the team were sweating away under the direction from the Secretary of State on a consultation on increasing tuition fees. So this feels like a bit of a flashback, to be honest, to some of that work. And we've moved from that to briefing the new minister. And we've certainly got a new minister who brings a lot of relevant background, both as a former minister for finance, but as someone who's come through FE, through Ulster and through Queen's, which I think is a useful background for him to have. But I guess through that process of looking at the issue of tuition fees and then briefing a new minister, the issue of complexity, which you touched on, is one that really comes home and comes across to us. John's already touched on the fact that the minister has 4 key priorities. I think there's a hugely important role for higher education to play across all of those. So good jobs. Universities are huge employers, and we shouldn't forget that. But actually, as well, you know, your ability to secure a good job is also related to your level of education, productivity. Again, you know, the level of qualifications, the important role of universities in research and development and innovation is absolutely critical there. And I guess just to pause on that, we're very much talking about an element of university finance here in terms of students and fees. There is significant income in research and development work and other strands as well. So it is in that broader context of the budget. regional balance is a really big focus, and the first thing that the Minister always mentions when he's talking about regional balance is the need to deliver on projects which will help regional balance, and certainly the existing executive commitment to get to 10,000 students on the Londonderry campus of Ulster University is very much within his sights. And indeed, some people have picked up, he's appointed 4 independent experts to help support him across those issues, which includes experts from higher education. He's been clear, though, the Minister, that he's not in favour of raising tuition fees, and that's partly perhaps about the cost of living crisis, families struggling, perhaps those attitudes too and concerns about debt. But he's also really focused on ensuring that we're not impeding access to education and skills because of the importance for the economy. And it certainly struck me over the last couple of years ago, whenever I've been involved in any work looking at foreign direct investment, for instance, when companies come over, what they are interested in is our universities and what they offer. And we're certainly, it's a huge benefit to Northern Ireland to have 3 really good universities and 2 really good university colleges alongside them. So, I mean, despite that, I think the Minister very much recognised both the pressures facing institutions and in particular the pressures facing students. There's a debate across the UK, as we've heard, but no less so here, and in the context of a reduced budget last year. Still significant sums of money being paid to support higher education, but in the context of a very difficult budget context. I think we've started to close the gap a little in recent years. I think the concern previously around 2015, there was a consultation called the Big Conversation, which was really focused on a gap in funding between, say, English universities and Northern Ireland. And I think as was flagged, the cost of living increases in the tuition fee and the freeze in most other parts of the UK has really started to close that gap. But as I say, we do recognise the pressures that are there. The Minister's been really clear that he wants us to do 2 things, really. One is to work in partnership with institutions to look for solutions, and secondly, to be really innovative in the approach we seek to take to finding those solutions. Higher education is a real focus at the minute. I've mentioned the expansion of the Magee campus as a really important one. I think the Minister will be looking closely at the issue of student support and maintenance support. He's very interested in issues such as north-south mobility, which will come back to some of those broader issues, and I'm sure he'll be working closely with his counterpart in the south, Simon Harris. And of course, issues such as widening participation, making sure, as I said, that there is access to higher education no matter what your background, will be very close to his heart. So we look forward to continuing conversations with the institutions, with student representatives and others as we seek to work together to address some of the challenges we face.
Fantastic. Thank you, Mark. Very helpful remarks. And finally, let's go to Ryan.
Okay, I have a hard stop at 3 o'clock, so if I walk out, I'm not protesting. Okay, I just want to make that very clear. Look, it's very hard to disagree with any of the previous speakers. I think from the very outset that any model has to be fair to students. So I think that's the premise which we have to come at this in terms of trying to solve the problem. And the Augur report, which was done in England a number of years ago, indicated that tuition fees is not any deterring young people from low-income backgrounds going into university. However, we need to deal in real politics, as Vice-Chancellor Bartholomew said, around the political issues in terms of increasing fees. So there's no more money in the pot. That's clear. We're not going to get any more money into the higher education system. And Paul has rightly said, at the moment we're spending about 54 to 56% of our block grant on health. That's not going to decrease. And further in higher education won't be high up the agenda when it comes to those issues which resonate with the public. We in Queen's are completely behind the Minister and Paul's vision to increase Magee to 10,000 students. with a very clear caveat that that's not about displacement. It's not about lifting students from this university and putting them into another university. It's about growing the sector. And at Queen's, we're about growth. That's what we believe in, not just growth in terms of student numbers, but growth in terms of our research profile, in terms of our economic and social contribution, not only to this region, but to the entire nation, 3.1 billion. For every £1 invested in Queen's, and Dominic rightly said, we need to look at an investment, not costs, you get £8 of a return. So it's very clear that we need to take that approach in terms of trying to motivate and move the economy. One of the things that our Vice-Chancellor, who apologises for not being here today because he's in England at two very important meetings, is looking at how we actually be a bit radical around our education system here in Northern Ireland to make it more fair, to make it more cooperative. And he's talked at length about a tertiary education system where we take the 2 university colleges, the 3 universities, the 6 further education colleges, and work together to try and make sure that we have access for opportunity right across the board. And I think that we need to really be radical around this, and Paul is right. There has to be pain on all sides. As we've said, absolutely increase McGee, but also look at increasing Queen's. We're happy to look at widening participation as our focus, taking more young people from low-income backgrounds into the university, looking at subject areas where we're tight. And Roisin McAvoy, who's our Director of Admissions, is here. She and the team work very hard to make sure that we try to get as many people in terms of our Mazen cap, without Mark giving us a fine, to ensure that we get people in from right across the sector. But 32% of our young people come from low-income backgrounds. And if we had an opportunity to grow our WP proposition, also give more to our university colleges, Brian's here and Jonathan's here, which is very, very important in terms of the work that St Mary's and Strand do as part of the wider Queen's family. That's the solution. But we need to sit around the table and hammer this out. Now, the Diamond Review in Wales might be the example, and Dominic Bryan and I had this conversation literally before we come into the room. The Minister should look at convening trade unions, convening students, convening civic and business leaders, convening the universities, the further education sector, and sitting around a table to see, can we hammer out a deal? Can we sit down and get something that will be acceptable to all sides, that recognises the issues that we're facing around cost of living, around access to education, around supporting our students in terms of their journey, in terms of fairness? The system at the moment isn't fair. The system at the moment is actually subventing the middle class. And the people that we're trying to help at the lower end of the economic decile are not getting equal access to higher education. So it's broken. And doing nothing is not an option. Mark talked about the big conversation. Well, no conversation, because we've had many reviews, we've had many deep dives into higher education, and nothing has changed. Because people are not willing, as Paul has said, to grasp the nettle. So if we want to be fair to students, we want to grow the economy, we want to use that economic benefit to promote education and invest in health and invest in innovation and really make this a knowledge economy, then we'll have to be radical. That can only be done if we're all around the table and we're willing to take a risk.
Fantastic, thank you. Before we move to questions, can we give a round of applause, please, to our wonderful panel? Right, so we're going to move to questions. We're going to have a couple of rounds, and what we'll do is, as before, we've got a couple of roaming mics. I have to say, I've got a couple of questions, but I'm going to hold back and let's go to the floor first. So if you do have any questions, could you please raise your hand? We'll come to you, and then we'll probably take a couple in one go, and then we'll go, and we'll probably go in reverse order, just to give you a heads up to prepare. So. Questions on anything that's been said so far, provocations and clarifications, all welcome. Yeah, so let's get to here.
Hi, Mark. I'll ask you just about maintenance grants versus maintenance loans as an option the department could pursue. Has that been discussed in any detail?
It's certainly something the Minister is interested in. Obviously, there's the costs fall in different ways between loans and grants, so it would be perhaps more challenging to afford an increase in grants. It would involve some difficult spending decisions in the department, but I think we're very conscious of the fact that the thresholds have been frozen for the last few years. Actually, the total spend
very many years.
Indeed, yeah, total spend has been dropping. So it's certainly something that the Minister is interested in, and that we'll be talking to him further about. But it will depend on, apart from anything else, the outcome of the the current budget discussions and what we've got in the kitty for 24-25.
Hello, everybody. Hi, my name's Nick Hillman. I'm director of HEPI, and I should have been here at the start. And I'm very grateful to Josh for chairing it. I woke up in Dublin this morning. It was very snowy, and the trains were all delayed. So, the question I wanted to ask was, I was struck by there seemed to be two messages in particular that came out from the panel. One was around the importance of student support. And the other was quite a lot of unanimity about Northern Ireland looking to Wales. And of course, this London Economics Nuffield study is looking at all four parts of the UK. But my understanding of the Welsh system is they're struggling to fund what they've got, and they've just, for example, had to move postgraduate funding from grants to loans. It made me think a little bit about taught postgraduate students, because we've had a lot of different student groups mentioned, including part-time students, and I just wondered if the panel had views about the supply of skills at the postgraduate level and how that linked to funding in Northern Ireland.
Great, thank you, Nick. I have a question as well to put to you all, and we'll answer them together. Obviously, London Economics have presented to us a couple of potential options, and they've presented these sort of economic consequences of this. But I just wondered if we might reflect on the sort of the political feasibility of either of those options. Are they likely? Are they reasonable in a political context, or because sort of is this something that we should be aiming for, really? So going in reverse order from previously. Let's start with Ryan.
Well, to answer the next question, postgraduate growth is one of our growth areas at Queen's. It's something that we really are focused on. We think there should be as many nudges as possible, whether it be through maintenance loans or the new loan that's been put in place, and that needs to be extended out to help people get into postgraduate taught courses. There's a very good offering at the three universities here in terms of postgraduate taught part-time and full-time. And obviously, if we're going to be a knowledge-based economy, we need to increase the capacity that we have right across the board. So, Nick, very, very important area. Political scientists in me will say, no, there's not going to be any appetite for this. I find Conor Murphy a very straight-talking minister. I think he's extremely capable. He has a very good track record in finance. His early interventions with both UU and Queen's have been particularly positive. I think he gets the sector. I think he gets the bigger picture. But we have an election here in the UK in, well, it could be May, it could be November, and we have an election in the South in 2025, and the likelihood of fees going up before any of those elections is unlikely. So I think it's about nudges. One of the things that we've discussed with the Minister and with Mark, and I'm sure Paul's done the same, is how do we look at our attrition rates from the Republic of Ireland? Rightly, and we're delighted with this, we have an increase in young people coming from the south to the north, and that's a very, very positive thing, but they are counted as home students within the Mazen cap, and we're looking to see if there's a way of uncoupling that, which is about 6% of Mazen, which will give us more home-based student places and hopefully help more people come from the south. There are other nudges that we can use to try and help the aim to increase McGee and grow the overall sector. So, but I think the reality for us is, and Paul has eloquently outlined this, there's no more money in the pot. It's very unlikely fees will be increased anytime soon, so we're just going to have to consolidate what we have.
Thank you. Mark?
Yeah, so a couple of things. I mean, I guess in terms of the options, one's financially attractive and politically unattractive, and the other one's politically attractive and financially unattractive. So we'll see where we go on that. I mean, just picking up on and sort of one other point related to that, I think, is just to be conscious. I mean, Ryan mentioned elections. I think the minister, when he was on his feet in the Assembly the other day, was very clear that they've got a 3-year mandate. It's a shortened mandate, and his focus will be really on what they can get done to make a positive impact. And there are some significant lags in changes to, for instance, student financing and the like. You know, there's quite a run into to changes that would be needed. So that's just a context for some of this discussion. I mean, the only thing I'd say on the kind of postgraduate offer is that I'm very conscious of the fact that our tuition fee loans for postgraduates are lower than they are in certainly England, and we probably don't have the range of products that England has in terms of loans. So I know there's a PhD loan product in England. We have a postgraduate award scheme here that we fund, which is a good thing. We're reviewing that at the minute, but I think there is a question around maybe some of the gaps in in provision that we have here, and the level of the tuition fee loan in particular for postgraduate courses.
Thank you. Paul?
Yeah, I think all of those things kind of go together, and we have aspirations for perhaps another model. I also think that we have to think about what are our aspirations about scalability. We don't have to scale forever, I mean, if you look at the English model, you just take as many students as you want. I don't think we have to take as many students as we want. I think we have to take as many students as we need. And that isn't actually a vast number. Domestic demand, probably, all other things being equal, between now and about 2028, we're probably looking at about another 4,500 students a year wanting to access Northern Ireland higher education institutions. At the moment, we won't be able to take them because we will be capped if we stay as we are. Implications for that, and I know that Mark has a slightly different view in that universities have options to go with parallel contextualised admissions, but broadly, the way the offer-making process goes, we have to predict and model how many people are going to be attracted to our courses based on the numbers of people who can get grades, and with an increasing demographic, excuse me, more people will get higher grades. So to be able to control our numbers, we will put the grades up, and that means that, we get to choose those, and then we use the rest of the apparatus up to and including clearing to control our numbers. What that inevitably means is those with lower grades just won't be able to come to the institutions in Northern Ireland. They'd have broadly been priced from a grades point of view out of the market, and the overlap between that and social disadvantage is high. Now, it doesn't mean we can't go down the route of contextualised offers and so forth, but that's a different thing for us as it relates to all sorts of things, from pedagogic to reputation and so forth. So we do have to think about the scale that we want, and I don't think it is enormous. I think it is easily within our gift to, even if we went part way, increase the fees to a particular level by which we could take the additional number of students that Northern Ireland would need to meet demand, and perhaps that would be enough. But it doesn't answer the other part of the equation, which is that's not the only, we're not just trying to serve the undergraduate population. There's a huge need for the postgraduate qualification. There's a department of the economy, representative sat to my right, representing a department that would like to see Northern Ireland being one of the best developed small industrial nations or regions of the world. And as a consequence of that, we really need those postgraduate skills. And there's no doubt that the financial provision for postgraduate students is inadequate. But in order to top that up, the money has to come elsewhere. But so we could layer on something on the fees part, push it into the student loans company, free up DFE to have a bit more money to commit into bolstering probably what would be something like a 12.5% increase in fees to be able to fund, 4,500 students by 2028. And in addition to that, give us greater financial instruments to support postgraduate talk. There is a way here to have our cake and eat it in Northern Ireland. Absolutely there is, within the same funding model. What we need to do is take on some of that political unpalatability that means that we cannot be absolutist in no to fees increase. That's just not going to get the job done. And we can all wish for a world where that wasn't the case. But it is the case. And as a consequence, let's use what we've got and segment it for what we need. How many postgraduates do we need? More, please. What will enable them to do it? Well, we need more access to funding for them. Where's it going to come from? The existing pot. How can we make more of the existing pot? We put more to the Students' Loan Company. It's not rocket science. But somehow we lose this when we just have these philosophical debates that a fee increasing somehow has a profound impact on affordability when it simply does not. And that needs to be addressed through a change in our preparedness to have that discourse. When I first came to Northern Ireland, and I said to a politician who I won't name, and I said around the notion of my view on student fees, he said, if you go out there and say outside, you'll be slaughtered. That was a quote. We have to get beyond you'll be slaughtered and say, well, we have a real issue. Let's find a real solution that delivers what we want in proportion of what we want it. I've gone on a bit. I'm sorry.
No, thank you. Is it just a quick follow-up on that? Is some of this sort of a marketing problem, like a branding problem?
Hugely. Just the nomenclature that we use around, fees, debt, so forth. It's not quite fees, not quite debt. Students don't actually pay fees. That was the bit actually that I would get slaughtered for. No, it's deferred. I mean, even in your presentation, you talk about student-stroke graduates because, it's only after you qualify. And broadly, I think what we're looking at is a funding system for which graduates pay into to allow the people behind them to benefit from the same system. That's, you could look. And actually, if you look at it through a particular lens, I nearly said the right lens, but it's my view. If you look at it through a particular lens, it's really progressive. We see that what happens if you get rid of it. It doesn't actually advantage at all the people who we might think off the top of our head, well, get rid of fees and those people who are really hard up will be much better off. They won't be. But they perhaps perceive they will be. And that's the marketing bit that you say. And you're not going to get around that with politicians' sound bites. You have to get into the detail. You have to run the spreadsheets. You have to show the charts, and you have to give enough people. This has been a bit unkind to politicians, but I do know when I started talking about this stuff, people glaze over after about 30 seconds because, they want to move on, want something that can be sold. We have to do better than that.
Thank you very much, Paul. Chloe.
Yeah, thank you so much. And just to reflect on something Paul was saying there in terms of the demographic growth of Northern Ireland, by 2028, which you're mentioning yourself, there's going to be more people up for the age of 64 in Northern Ireland than those of the younger generations, which poses a really interesting question for lifelong education, for postgraduate study, for how we frame education as an ecosystem for people themselves to engage in terms of should we be front-loading funding into the traditional education system? Should we be, as been mentioned across the panel, more focusing on these skill top-up classes, qualifications, so short-term qualifications? And these are questions that I think, I can completely agree with you that we need to be getting into the nitty-gritty. We need to be thinking we can take inspiration from the Diamond Review, to an extent the Augur Review, and different places around the world, particularly looking at Norwegian and Scandinavian models too, in terms of how they build a commitment into the education system of you develop skills here, you need to bring them back into the economy as well too, for certain periods of time. And so there is a real discussion that needs to be had in that nitty-gritty sense of how we can make education better, not just copying anywhere from across another home nation or anywhere internationally, but as we're saying in our aspirations to make the North this wonderful and highly skilled and adequately skilled place, how we can draw inspiration from lots of different models and actually do something a wee bit different that leads the way for Northern Ireland to be this education absolute superpower. And you really, when you look at across the ambitions of the people that we have here, that is totally within the scope of what they're looking for. Just to touch briefly as well on the postgraduate offer, and then also taking in hand the 10,000 students with McGee. For us to offer student places, we need to have the infrastructure available for students to actually engage in their learning. And I know I'll sound like a wee bit like a repetitive record here, but to have 10,000 students in McGee or increase our postgraduate student officer, we need to ensure there's affordable bed spaces for them to live in, to ensure their nightlife economy, because it's part of a student life, depending on where you come from, or why you're attending university, is also part of having a bit of fun, growing life, getting a second job, exploring volunteering opportunities. We need to ensure that students have access to all of those key fundamentals, whether that is housing, whether that is work or funding to be able to pay their bills, to actually supplement the education system and have the capacity to grow their skills to further in the last place. And then just in terms of that cross-border element, there's a bit of work there in terms of north-south mobility, also in terms of students coming from the south of Ireland, in terms of accessibility and application of the SUSI grant process, because whilst there can be, I may get this wrong, so please someone in the panel correct me if I have, there's supplementary of the tuition grant, but in terms of maintenance, it's just not doable. So we need to be looking, especially at this mobility process, how we can integrate it at that cross-border level that actually works for people. So I agree, nitty-gritty policy needs to be looked into, but I suppose just from that political aspect is education is such a tool for success, and we really have a lot of people who are willing to buy into it. You've got this panel here, you've got everyone in this room, you've got people who would maybe want to be in the room but don't know how to get into it. There is so many options ahead of us that we really can build something with the will. Our motivations are all the same here, basically, that we want to get to the best place for NI, we want to get to the best place for people. It's just the journey and how we're going to do it. So
fantastic. Well, we'll come to you, John, in a second. I just wanted to check just in the last minute, if anyone has any other final questions they'd like to put to the panel, we'll maybe come to with John. There's always questions right at the last minute. Right, I'll take a couple of questions and then we'll do very quick, sort of no more than 30-second responses, if that's okay on this. So let's go one.
Yeah, I'm just going to pick up on by the way, Chloe, I love the comment, education superpower. I love that for Northern Ireland. I was going to ask the question, obviously we've focused here, we've talked about funding, we've talked about supporting regional balance as well. And as we have grown our Derry London Derry campus significantly, we're obviously encountering issues not just with HE funding, but also actually the support for the wider infrastructure in Derry, and there's a real import there for an understanding that there needs to be investment across government departments to make sure that the infrastructure is there in the Northwest to enable us and to facilitate the growth that we're planning for the Northwest. Just things like having the bed spaces, as you rightly alluded to, having access to GP spaces and dental practices and all of the infrastructure that's required for us to grow the university and higher education within the city. Just what are and perhaps Mark, it's for you in terms of what's the thinking within the wider governance space and all of the departments about how we support that?
Thank you. We'll come to you in a moment. There's one over here. Yeah.
Thank you. I suppose my question builds on that as well, in that it isn't just Conor Murphy's job alone to do this in the executive as well. It's across the whole piece. But I was thinking really around what a political football this is, and that we have to have faith in Conor Murphy in order to deliver this. But I'm interested as well in recommendations from the Royal Irish Academy, for example, around expansion, around the establishment of a specific body to expand McGee, for example. So is there a role respecting institutional autonomy? Is there a different way that the panel thinks that we could look at the governance as well of higher education institutions? And is there a way to actually take it a little bit out of the political sphere and think about it as a tool of economic development that an independent body could maybe play a bigger role in?
Yeah, mine is a little bit off topic from the previous question. So my name is Beth. I'm the president at Queen's Students' Union at the minute. And I just kind of want to ask about international students and student debt within international students. I mean, I think there's maybe a bit of a misconception in the general public that international students come here and they're kind of well off and they can afford the fees that they pay. The majority of the students that I would speak to and the majority of students that we would see actually come and they are here on familial debt. They're relying on money that their family is suffering from not having back home. And I suppose they come with a fixed amount of money. And if we keep increasing fees for international students, we're decreasing the money that they then have when they arrive to live off. So I suppose, what do you think the sustainability is of the Northern Ireland higher education funding system on relying on international students, as it kind of does in a lot of ways? And I suppose we've seen drop-offs in international student applications already, and we've had to put in place different measures, which is great. But if and when these kind of international student numbers keep on declining because they're being priced out of Northern Ireland and they're going to more attractive places like America and Australia, what is the impact for Northern Ireland and how can we kind of mitigate that?
Great, thank you. We've got quick 5 responses, please, on this. We'll start with Ryan, because I know you've got to go.
Yeah, and I'm going to walk out, but I'm not walking out in protest, just to tell you as well, because I have a hard stop at 3 o'clock that I can't get out of, as much as I tried. I think on the international student bit, Beth's right, and we've put a new triple lock process in place to try and keep our fees secured, not only in terms of fees, but in terms of accommodation costs. I'm looking at Roisin here and making sure she's nodding, because she'll know all about it, or David, 2 people I depend on to keep me right. So we put that in place, and it's a very good point. But let's be clear, international students are subventing the system. Without international students in our higher education system in Northern Ireland, we're in big trouble. And both UU and Queen's and OU and the 2 university colleges actually subvent our higher education system in this region. Let's be clear about that. So through our research or innovation or commercial spin-outs, we are actually putting money back into the system because the teaching grant does not cover the full cost of educating an undergraduate student. So that's a fact, clear. Secondly, the point at the back there about independence or governance, I would love a situation where we would have some independent board or a NHS board to come in and run higher education. Politically, it won't happen. However, that doesn't stop us working hard to make sure we grow the sector, that we grow the 10,000 students in McGee, Talk about infrastructure, vitally important. I think that's a very, very good point. This is a cross-executive approach. We need to look at getting a better road to Derry, which is great because it'll cut 20 minutes off my journey down to see my mother. And we also need to look at how we really, really push the regional balance. But one thing in regional balance, just quickly, regional balance is very important, and we really are behind the Northwest, but we need to remember that there are different organisations across the region that actually engage in regional balance, and we're one of them. We've 2,500 students from Derry here in Queens. We have about 25,000 alumni. Our spin-outs last year on our commercial contracts were worth about 18 million to Derry, about 28 million to Newry and Armagh. So it's very, very important that we don't confuse presence with regional balance, because that's not always the case. And with that, I'm going to leave. So thank you.
Thank you, Ryan. Liberal interpretation of 30 seconds. Thank you. Can we just keep them really, really short, because I know people have got to go. Chloe.
Yeah, I'll keep this short and sweet. I think to say on the international student question, we should be really honoured that we're having these people come to Northern Ireland, and they want to bring their skills, they want to bring their talent, they want to bring their culture, and they want to contribute to the society around them. We should feel really special, and to be just completely blunt. And so when they're here, we should be making sure that they feel a part of the community. We should make sure their access is just as equitable as anyone else. To pick up on a policy point that is one of my favourite things to talk about, is that we need to be extending the common travel area, for example, if we're going to talk about this cross-border mobility process particularly, which again, we're very supportive of expanding student numbers in McGee, but building that infrastructure there to support students, I think we're all on the same page with needs to happen. Extending that common travel area, so international students that are non-EAA, are able to actually cross-border without being deported and detained is probably quite an important thing that we need to get onto to nurture this cross-border education. In terms of that multi-department...
Sorry, Chloe, can we move on? I know we've got to get people out. John.
Thanks very much. Just to pick up the point about that not just being the job of the Department of the Economy, at the risk of maybe breaking news or spoiler alert, there are two initiatives which might help with that, because I'm not sure the big idea will get there. One of them is the all-party group on skills will be getting launched on the 11th of April this year. It's been led by Saoirse Eastwood, Diane Dodd, Sinead McLaughlin and Cathy Mason, and we'll be as the Open University Secretariat for that. So I think that gives us a forum for that wider discussion. And also the Alliance for Lifelong Learning is a loose coalition of the Open University, Open College Network, Forum for Adult Learning, CO3 and AINTUS, so yeah, all island adult learning organisations. So they will be taking forward advocacy, lobbying, evidence-based to all the departments and all the ministers. So I think that should give some petrol in the engine there.
Great, thank you. Paul?
I'll just first of all address the international one. I think it's really, really important that universities don't see international students just as an income line to supplement everything else. They bring critical diversity to Northern Ireland and richness to our cohorts, and we should embrace them in that asset. Of course, there are UK policies that are underpinning the drop-off in student numbers absolutely, in terms of postgraduate taught and dependence, as seen, between some 40% and 60% drop off in applications, and that's critical. On the other ones, both the Shane and Jason's question around the Northwest, there are no quick fixes. There are no quick fixes in the infrastructure piece. That's why we have to go kind of incrementally. And in terms of the RIA review, not fantastically a fan, because I think it looks like it's a quick fix. Oh, if only we could have that review, everything would be all right. If only we could have that oversight body, everything would be all right. The oversight body is just taking on exactly the same issues that we're already discussing. If anybody thinks we're not taking it seriously and somehow having some independent will allow us to do some additional thinking, think again. That's simply not the case. And so far, we've been compared up there in the Northwest with student numbers no longer looking at 10, now looking at 20, 25, because that's what they've got in Galway. That's what they've got in Limerick. Well, that's just some form of magical thinking, really, in relation to what we're at. We're not in that jurisdiction. We have very different constraints, not least in relation to international student numbers. So no, I don't really buy the whole RIA thing. There are people in the Northwest who won't be surprised for me to say that. But what will it actually achieve other than looking at the issue? Believe me, we're looking at the issue.
Thank you. And Mark, you have the last word.
Yes, so just on international students, I think a part of the value of university is coming and getting exposure to different cultures, different kinds of people, so we need to view them as an important kind of part of higher education, not just, as I think Paul said, a funding line. And I think certainly the Minister was very seized of the point after a conversation with Paul that within Derry it's about creating the context to get to 10,000 students. It's not just something where we look to the university and say, when are you going to do it? That's your issue. And we do have some helpful political context in terms of the Department for Infrastructure having a minister from the same party as we do in the Department for Economy. So I think that point is well understood. And I think will be reflected in the way that we move forward on that particular ambition.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. One last round of applause, please, for our panelists. Great, thank you. We have just a couple of last things to round things off. So we have just got, my apologies, just gone a couple of minutes over, but I think it was a particularly enlightening conversation that we had at the end. So thank you very much for that. I'm very grateful to a number of people for making this happen, just a couple of people to thank. The team at Queen's University Belfast for facilitating us and making this possible. Our wonderful panellists, of course, my colleagues at HEPI, including Emma, who's done the bulk of the work organising this and is fantastic, and Gavin and Micah from London Economics as well. If you want to continue the conversation, we hope that you will. We've got events in Edinburgh on Monday and in Cardiff on Wednesday, in case you happen to be in one of those two cities on those days. And this is only the beginning of the conversation. So London Economics have already mentioned the further work they're doing. And obviously on HEPI, we're always continuing the conversation on this and a wide range of other topics. So please do follow us online. Thanks very much for coming.